Howdy, Crumbums. It's time once again for Canonically Crumb, the only show that explores the comics and characters of the Crummyverse. In his landmark book, The Wolf, The Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species, published in 1970, biologist Lucian David Mech described the complex social structure of a wolf pack. A hierarchy, with the largest wolf, the alpha male, gaining his position as pack leader through violent displays of strength and domination, earning him priority access to food and mating opportunities, while the smaller submissive wolves take a subordinate position to the alpha as betas, lapping up whatever scraps are left over. At least, that was a takeaway for every success mindset grifter, pickup artist, and manosphere dingus for the next 50 years. But the thing is, it was all bullshit. Not only is there no scientific evidence that the social structures observed in wolves are naturally emergent in human beings, they aren't even natural for wolves. Turns out Mech's study was based on wolves in captivity. In the wild, wolf packs are literally family units, and the leaders are the mommy and daddy of all the other wolves in the group. And to his credit, Mech has written several books since, correcting his original observations as new information became available. Nevertheless, the alpha-beta concept that he helped to popularize has been absorbed into the lexicon of mainstream politics and media, and they form an ideological framework for the various reactionary male chauvinist subcultures, perhaps most notably, the incels. But even if the evolutionary arguments for an alpha-beta dichotomy in humans is a bunch of spurious nonsense, which it is, there is nevertheless a sort of ecstatic truth to the idea, which anyone who has ever been victim to bullying in the prison-like conditions of high school can attest to. And that was certainly the experience for a couple of perpetual wimps in the late 1950s named Charles and Robert Crumb, and the inspiration for the subject of today's episode. It's Canonically Crumb number 15, Scutch, The Bully's End. As always, we need to acknowledge that, for our purposes, Robert Crumb's canon includes the Yum Yum Book, the Complete Crumb, the Weirdo Years, Zap, Hup, Mystic Funnies, and a bit of Dirty Laundry. Scutch first appeared on the cover of Yellow Dog number 13, published by the Print Mint in 1969. And that's about it. He's not even inside the issue or anything. He's a delinquent teenage greaser character, an overripe even then cartoon stereotype, rooted in the rebellious fashion and attitudes of the urban working-class youth subculture of post-World War II North America, which was popularized by pop culture figures like Marlon Brando, James Dean, and, what's his name? Elvis. It's a stock character of 1950s nostalgia in films like Grease, American Graffiti, and Cry Baby, but probably most famously played by Henry Winkler as Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli, aka The Fonz, on the popular TV show Happy Days, which ran from the mid-1970s into the early 80s. But the style still lives on in the rockabilly scene, custom culture, and hipster barbershops and shit like that. Scutch is perched upon Lil Cute's nylon-clad knee, a character that we'll certainly cover in a future episode. His classic greaser look is complete with leather jacket, slicked back hair, and a switchblade stiletto knife, which he uses to carve "Scutch was here" on her calf. They appear alongside the Daily Duck and Absorbine Jr., who probably won't be the subject of future episodes, so I'll cover them now real quick like. The Daily Duck is just kind of a stereotypical cartoon duck character, a subgenre of the funny animal comics which were popular in the 1950s, most notably Carl Barks's Uncle Scrooge, but also my personal favorite, Al Figale's Super Duck, the cockeyed wonder, which Crumb would lampoon in Mystic Funnies number 3 over 30 years later. There certainly are other one-off duck characters in the Crummyverse, such as Chuck the Duck from Comical Comics and XYZ Comics in 1972, but I'll dig all those up when I do a Super Duck episode at some point in the distant future. Absorbing Jr. is just kind of a dumb goober as far as I can tell. Stupid Jerk comes to mind as a similar type character, but who knows if Absorbing would even have been a talking character if he had been developed more. I kinda like him as the silent nose-pickin' type. I suspect Absorbing Jr. is in the naming convention of characters like Lil Iodine and Little Aspirin, both newspaper strips that had comic book adaptations in the late 1940s and early 50s, when the Crumb Boys would have been reading kids' comics. Now, instead of iodine or aspirin, Crumb went with a different medicinal name, Absorbing Jr. Absorbing was originally a liniment for horses.
No, sir, I don't like it.
Which, at some point in the early 1910s, was reformulated for humans and heavily marketed as Absorbing Jr. Dancing anthropomorphic father-son absorbing bottles actually appeared in a 1936 Happy Harmonies cartoon. So that was the level of cultural cachet the brand once had. Neither the Daily Duck nor Absorbing Jr. appear, to my knowledge, anywhere else within the canon, not even inside the book that they're presented on the cover of. But they do each have a non-canonical sketchbook appearance. Returning to Scutch, he has 2 cameos on the cover of the Complete Crumb Volume 4, which I guess canonically comes before Yellow Dog number 13, but the Complete Crumb series wasn't published until decades after 1969. Scutch is depicted twice in the waves of ether percolating off of Robert's skull as he peaks on acid in 1967 at the genesis of the Crummyverse, a scene that we talk about oh so often, which suggests that Scutch was part of the overall LSD revelation that really kicked off the Happy Hippie era. And he does appear in the sketchbooks from that mystical period, alongside Angel Food McSpade, Mr. Natural, Lil Cute, and more, in this psychedelic parade of Crummyverse characters. But Scutch didn't make it to the canonical rendition of that same parade, which was published in the East Village Other a few months later. And while we do get a few panels featuring generic greasers, brutalizing android women and playing suicidal rocket chicken in City of the Future from Zap number 0 in 1967, Scutch himself doesn't explicitly appear in the canon until the Yellow Dog cover in 1969. The sketchbooks from the period are pretty much the same as the canon after his initial appearance. You find the odd generic greaser, but nothing that really feels like a fully formed Scutch. However, there is this page where Crumb was seemingly working up a Scutch character, alongside some other typical teenagers, a la Archie Comics.
Stay out of Riverdale.
And you can imagine how Scutch would have fit in with Forky O'Donnell, Pete the Teenage Prick, and others in that 1950s teen comic vein, which he was exploring at the time. But Crumb didn't really end up making that many satirical 1950s high school comics in the late 1960s and early 70s period. At least not relative to comics featuring either child age or adult characters anyway. You know, for every Spiegel and Schlegel, there's a white man and a Bobo Belinsky, or a Big Baby and Little Harriet. In part, I think the reason for this is that the speed with which the youth counterculture movement expanded in the late 1960s made it so that teenage characters had more utility satirizing contemporary hippies. Like 14-year-old drug-crazed runaway Honey Bunch Kaminsky, for example. But something else we get around this time in the canon and in the sketchbooks are cartoons of Charles Crumb and about Charles and the childhood that he and Robert shared. I mean, in that same issue of Yellow Dog from 1969, you have Ups and Downs with Chuck and Bob, a reimagining of a comic they made together as children in 1958. And the following year, you get the first appearance of Robert's version of Charles's childhood characters, funny friends, Fuzzy and Donnie, who kind of play the same role as Chuck and Bob, and who definitely will be the subject of future episodes. But the thing about these early comics, about the Brothers Crumb, is that they're not really grappling directly with their shared trauma. Yet. So this is the second reason why I think that you don't get a fully executed Scutch character at this point in the Crummyverse, and this is a spoiler for a couple minutes from now, is that Scutch is a central figure around which so much of their teenage trauma orbits. You know, I think those wounds were still a little raw in the late 1960s, and perhaps Crumb hadn't yet developed the artistic and, frankly, emotional tools to grapple with it. He was still in his 20s and fresh off of his revelatory LSD experiences, and a daily smoker of marijuana in the late 1960s and early 70s. And while I've come to find this happy hippie period to be the most unbridled and interesting of Crumb's oeuvre, he was also flailing about quite a bit at the time. But as the hippie movement crested and inevitably hit that wall, and if we breeze past this Scutch cameo on the cover of the illustrated checklist of underground comics published in 1979, that's 3 covers total for Scutch, both Robert and the Crummyverse matured and evolved. As Crumb put it in an interview with Jean-Pierre Mercier in 1999, after you've been around long enough, you see these patterns developing so that you're no longer just banging your head against a wall. You start to get the bigger picture. It's very interesting to try and do stories about the big picture of your life and what you learned from it or failed to learn from it. That quote was referring to My Troubles with Women Part 2, which was published in Hup number 1 in 1987. And Crumbums, this is where we truly get
Scotched.
In the opening panel, Crumb depicts himself puffing a pipe in his Playboy pajamas and smoking jacket. Very classy. He's accompanied by Prue Frock Piggy, a small, Porky-esque pig character that first appeared chronologically in the R. Crumb success story from People's Comics in 1972. Prue Frock, in stories like I Remember the 60s from Weirdo number 4 in 1981, and If I Was a King from Hup number 2 in 1987, serves as a sort of visual anchor for Crumb when he jumps between his mind palace and the real world. So it makes sense that he'd appear here when Crumb is reflecting on his youth. This suave, self-actualized Crumb recounts from the present, my first hard lessons about women came soon after puberty. There was this guy in our high school named Scutch. Scutch was the #1 big man, the most handsome, charming, and self-confident male in the entire school, which is emphasized in profile by his emanating majesty, rolled-up collar, and DA haircut, which of course stands for duck ass. Crumb actually talks about these panels himself in the 1994 documentary by Terry Zwigoff. So let's roll the tape.
This mean bully, but he was also very charming, and all the girls liked him. He was the dreamboat, but he was also a bully. And my brother Charles was one of the guys he singled out for particular attention, and he had this gang of flunkies that hung around with him, this guy Scutch. So I just remember this scene where they're Scutch punches out my brother in the hallway at school. It was a very sad sight for me to see. Charles gave up trying to be popular or have girlfriends or anything after everybody saw that he couldn't fight back. He was beat up by Scutch.
I think it's worth restating that these beatings, which were a common occurrence for Charles throughout his high school career, were ritualized spectacles intended to publicly emasculate him in front of his peers. You see, Charles wasn't a lanky dork with goony glasses and no front teeth, like his brother R. You know, he was a pretty good-looking kid. But he was also a wimp, and ostensibly a closet homosexual. And these beatings by Scutch were a public demonstration of Charles's natural position at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Kind of like that trope of prison where someone fights you on your first day just to see if you'll fight back.
You're gonna catch a beating any day now. That's just the way it is. I lost 3 teeth, cracked a vertebrae. Anyway, all you gotta do is fight back. Win or lose, just fight back. Or you could try to suck the guy's dick. Your choice.
Charles's high school humiliation was so thorough that it stained the other Crumb brothers. On the next page, Robert depicts his own threatening encounter with Scutch and his gang, saying that he essentially made himself invisible in order to get along. And even little Maxon, who would have only been a freshman when Charles was a senior, couldn't escape the stain. In a 1972 interview with Promethean Enterprises, Robert said, "My older brother was so unpopular that my younger brother, who was fairly well liked in his grade, was punched out by this guy, just for being my older brother's brother. He said, 'Are you Charlie Crumb's brother?' He said, 'Yeah,' and the guy punched him." Guilt through blood. We're mainly focused on Scutch here, but to hear Robert and Charles tell it, everyone in Milford High School hated Charles.
You were actually sort of good looking and everything. But there was just this something that was wrong with my personality. I don't know.
The teachers hated him, the kids hated him.
High school was an absolute nightmare. I was the most unpopular kid in the high school. People were always picking on me and beating me up, and the girls wouldn't have anything to do with me. They treated me like I was the scum of the earth.
And he means everyone, Crumb bums. In a letter to Robert from the early 1980s, Charles recounts an incident in study hall where a young and handsome male teacher, who he had something of a boyhood crush on, walked up to Charles's desk and slapped him violently across the face. He says he had to have some reason for doing it, perhaps the nature of my involuntary staring at him whenever I passed him in the corridor made him suspect me of unnatural desires, and he felt an irresistible urge to revenge himself on me for this. A fellow student egged Charles on to tell the principal, and he left study hall to report the incident to Principal Atkinson, who simply said, "If Mr. So-and-so slapped you across the face, it was probably because you deserved it." The attitude at the time was that physical violence is simply social discipline, and this is endemic of an older conservative view of bullying, which is still expressed by right-wing intellectuals, many who are ironically themselves wimpy, mollycoddled pussy boys, like, for example, internet crybaby and disgraced psychologist Jordan Peterson, who said of Bart Simpson's bully, Nelson Muntz, "Without Nelson, king of the bullies, the school would soon be overrun with resentful, touchy Millhouses, narcissistic, intellectual martyred princes, soft, chocolate-gorging German children, and infantile Ralph Wiggums. Muntz is a corrective, a tough, self-sufficient kid who uses his capacity for contempt to decide what line of immature and pathetic behavior simply cannot be crossed." Putting aside that Nelson, so-called king of the bullies, is arguably on a lower rung from Jimbo Dolphin Kearney, the idea that bullying and corporal punishment serve a beneficial social Darwinistic function by mercilessly brutalizing to the fringes of society wimps, queers, and epileptics is undermined by the success and high social standing of the insufferable geeks like Jordan Peterson, who embraced this idea in the first place. And speaking of incels, the My Troubles with Women series really lays out how Robert began to develop and internalize his proto-incel theories about women. That girls are simply biologically attracted to strong, confident, and casually cruel bad boys with chiseled good looks, while sweet, kind, and intelligent nice boys are banished to the friend zone, doomed to a life of jerking off in squalor. However, I think that's a discussion that is better explored in an episode about Cave Wimp from 1989, which I think is the ultimate Crummyverse distillation of that worldview. But before we move on from this incellery, I do want to give a reminder to any younger millennials, Gen Z, and especially to the insufferably woke of all ages who might be watching this. I mean, statistically, you probably aren't, but still, a reminder that prior to the 2010s, Angry Virgin wasn't like a political identity. And while these ideas and feelings and weirdos all existed before then, you didn't hear about it or interact with them or really see it represented in the mainstream, except maybe in the most abstract and benign ways. And so I think giving voice to the very real alienation and loneliness of young men, which has been weaponized today, had a lot more artistic impact 40 years ago. So try to set any exhaustion aside that you might have with the girls don't like nice guys crowd for this episode. Anyway, we have some other panels to get to here, featuring canonical appearances of Scutch and Scutch-like characters, or Scutch-esque characters. In terms of direct cameos, I think we can infer from his interactions with the Crumb brothers that we saw in Hup number 1 that there's a strong probability that the bully in this panel from Dumb in Zap number 13, published in 1994, this greaser calling Crumb a fucking queer and threatening to stomp his fucking ass, is probably Scutch. You know, it's the same language, and he's got his flunky there. But Crumb does sometimes employ greaser types for brutish characters that are not always Scutch. For example, in this panel from Treasure Island days from 1978, where a couple of hoods beat up Charles for yelling while dressed as the dread pirate Long John Silver.
Avast, you swabs! Be you the dirty scoundrel what's stolen Flint's gold?
Neither tough could be Scutch, because that comic takes place in 1955 in Oceanside, California, the year before the Crumb family moved to Milford, Delaware, which is Scutch country. Also, Pachuco and his flunky here, in this Brombo the Panda comic from Weirdo number 2 in 1981, were probably somewhat inspired by Scutch and his gang. After all, Pachuco has the same duck-ass haircut, and his flunky says, "Things haven't changed much since the 50s, Panda." And of course, Brombo was a character Robert made comics about in the early 1950s when he was 9 years old or 10. So it's a kind of stand-in for himself as well. And while the initial sketches for the comic show Pachuco was always gonna not be Scutch, if you go back a little farther, you can see the development of more Scutchy designs in the lead-up. So, I think we've covered all of the direct Crummyverse appearances, but there are some indirect canonical mentions of Scutch in dialogue by other characters. Jumping back into My Troubles with Women Part 2, we see a young Robert wrenching his heart over hearing these girls titter with envy over Barbara's big date with Scutch. It's a panel that harkens back to My Troubles with Women, now called My Troubles with Women Part 1, from Zap number 10 in 1982, where a friend-zoned nice guy Robert tries to nudge Karen away from her inattentive, arrogant boyfriend Mike. But In a 2017 interview on crumbproducts.com, the official R. Crumb website, Robert said, "I overheard these two girls talking. Oh, did you hear? Karen got a date with Scutch? Oh my God, she's so lucky. And it just made me sick inside." Which leads me to wonder if these two incidents from My Troubles Part 1 and 2 are somewhat conflated. Like, maybe Karen is the one who had a hot weekend date with Scutch. I actually have access to Charles and Robert's 1959 and 1961 graduating yearbooks from Milford High School. Go Buccaneers! So I thought it might be fun to see how many classmates I can identify, cross-referenced with comics and sketches and such. Now, technically Robert graduated from Dover High. Go Senators! But 61 was still his graduating year, and we'll see he seems to be more fixated on those Milford girls of his early high school career. I couldn't find Karen in any of the yearbooks. You know, maybe she's from Dover. But a Barbara Tebbins appears on a sketchbook page from 1988 with the heading, "Girls in My Class at Milford High School That I Lusted After." And we'll be looking at this page quite a bit. Here's her graduating photo. Or she could be Barbara Wilkins, who Crumb would sketch in 1998 from the 1958 Milfordian yearbook, which I don't have access to. But this is her sophomore photo from 1959. Or, most sensational of all, perhaps she was the inspiration for the girl stuck in a window fantasy, which we'll see later in My Troubles with Women Part 2. Barbara Fox, who Crumb names in a sketch from late 1998, describing her as a big loudmouth girl from his class that lived up the street. This is her sophomore photo if you're interested in what her face looked like. The girl with glasses and a ponytail looks quite a bit like Nancy Gorman from Footsie in Weirdo Number 20 from 1987. I couldn't find a photo of her, but in the comic she plays a knife-throwing game, which Crumb calls either Poison or Chicken, and which I know of as Split the Kipper, against Jeanette Bates, who, according to that comic, used to flirt and play footsie with Crumb, hence the title, in American history class in 1956 or 1957. He would thereafter have fantasies of Jeanette, legs prone, with their heads stuck in various places. So perhaps the legs of the girl stuck in the window in My Troubles with Women Part 2 belonged to Jeanette after all. Jeanette, or Ginny as we find out she was better known, also appeared on the aforementioned sketchbook page, as well as on an earlier one. And in fact, her last name wasn't Bates, rather it was Betts, and apparently she can resist anything but temptation. In Footsie, she tries to tempt an awkward teenage Robert to her house, claiming to have something of his. But he was too much of a dope at the time to realize that she was actually hitting on him, which kind of disproves the whole girls don't like nice guys rhetoric. Speaking of Footsie, not the comic, the game, in My Troubles Part 2, Crumb mentions playing footsie with a Bridget in science class in 9th grade. Bridget appears twice in the sketchbook, first as Bridget Franceschini, and then as Bridget Coscarelli on the 1988 Girls page. But in the yearbook, Bridget Coscarelli's first name is spelt like my last name, which really caught my eye when I was going through these things. She was actually a little older than Robert, being in Charles's graduating year, so it's odd that she would have been in the same science class as Robert. The way she's described in her profile, as a chattering chicken who loves to eat ice cream and who swims the channel in her spare time, makes me wonder if she was an early inspiration for Patricia Pig, a character we'll no doubt cover in a future episode. His buddy here, who I'm pretty sure is Ernie Mesnick, and who appears, along with his 98-cent switchblade in Footsie, even refers to Bridget as, "What a hog!" and says, "That fat ass of hers is knocking into everybody in the hallway." To which Crumb nervously replies, "Yeah, no wonder she's always saying beep beep," overcompensating to hide his raging lust for big-bottom Bridget. And I guess she lived near the Crumb homestead, because he depicts himself sneaking a peek over the fence while she basks in the sun reading an article about Bobby Darin.
Every night I hope and pray a dream lover will come my way.
Another secret crush was Dolly Hensley, who sat to the right of him in that same history class, and another notch on Crumb's sandals, as he also played footsie with her. Sometimes, even with both Dolly and Ginny at the same time. Dolly is on the 88 sketchbook page along with the others, but her first canonical appearance was actually in My Troubles with Women Part 1 in the early 1980s, where Crumb seethes with jealousy at the sight of poor Dolly being led like a dog by the class ring around her neck of one of the meanest and jerkiest guys, who he describes as a Fonz type.
W.
Could this be an unnamed Scutch appearance? Well, I don't think Crumb was trying to protect anyone's good name or anything in Part 1 of My Troubles, because in the next panel, he flat out names his most hated enemy, Bucky Sullivan, who I was surprised to find out wore glasses, because Crumb omits that detail in My Troubles and also in this later sketch of Bucky from 1998. In Footsie, he actually describes Dolly's boyfriend as one of the school's prominent alpha males, a real SOB named Wayne something or other. And he depicts him gripping her by his class ring once again, and publicly smacking poor Dolly in the face while she whimpers. He's shouting, "Hey, I thought I told you to wait in the car." A car that Dolly described as neat, in this more stylized depiction of the couple in the comic Dumb. In the R. Crumb Handbook, we get his full name, Wayne Parker, who eagle-eared crumb bums might remember from the last episode, that's number 14, Angel Food McSpade, that he bragged about physically dragging a little black girl out by her hair during the riot that broke out when Milford High School attempted integration. So check that episode out. He was in Charles's graduating class, and he was described as the class clown. So I'm inclined to believe that this is Wayne Parker. And it's why I didn't mention this Scutch-like face squeezer who had an earlier canonical appearance in All Meat Comics from Big Ass number 1 in 1969. Note the class ring. And let's just do a few more yearbook pages before we move on. There's Susie Mills, aka Millsy, who likes subs, french fries, and Bill.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
We have Carol Jean Jeannie Straley, who luckily Crumb included the unlikely pronunciation of her last name. There's Nancy Nicely, who was a majorette. And while I couldn't find Winona, the Shelf, Newhouse, I'm guessing she's also the Winona who appears in My Troubles with Women Part 2. Although, interestingly, Crumb draws a Sue the Shelf Corcoran later in that comic, but I couldn't find her in the yearbooks either. Shirley Davis appears on the 88 sketchbook page, a real all-around girl, who Crumb drew a sketch of all the way back in 1969, remarkably similar to how he depicted Ginny Bates in Footsie. In fact, the cover to the Complete Crumb Volume 1, which was drawn in the same year as Footsie, appears to show the same scene, only this one features a blonde, like Shirley. And in the 1994 documentary, he points to Shirley on this page and says,
I never actually had any contact with these girls except I used to play footsie with this one. Where are they now? 30 years ago.
So either he swapped Shirley out for Ginny, or this kid was getting more footsie than a shoe store? I don't know. Speaking of Ginny, in a series of 2003 sketches, Crumb drew Ginny Betts' hockey teammates, Lila Burris, or is that Lila Burris, and Donga Valisis, or is it Danja Valisis? Donja Valesis? They're tough ones to pronounce, but here's all three of them together. Here they are together again, on the front row of this photo of the girls' varsity basketball team. And directly behind Ginny Bates is Sue Kirby, who Crumb also drew in his sketchbook in 2002. And this one, Naomi Wilson, was actually in the grade below Crumb. I have both her freshman and junior photos. In the Crumb documentary, Crumb gives this not-so-flattering description of the crush that he had on her.
This one here, Naomi Wilson, is this cross-eyed farm girl that wore homemade clothes to school. I secretly had a crush on her. I was very sexually attracted to her. Of course, you could never dare admit it openly that you liked this funky girl that had BO and hairy legs.
He did a second sketch of her later in '88, which elaborates further, and you can pause the video here if you want to read that. But the person I couldn't find in either yearbook was the one I was looking for the most. Scutch. And I know his real name from Terry Zwigoff's audio commentary on the Criterion edition of Crumb.
So I asked Robert if he remembered Scutch's real name, because I'd like to look him up and film him for the film. This guy in high school. Robert said his name was Dwayne Kenton. So I actually found a phone number for him. He's living still back in around Milford, Delaware, and I called him up, and he said he owned a recycling business for the last 10 years, and I was trying to get a sense of him. I couldn't tell if he, just owned this sort of redneck junkyard, or if he was like this, sort of progressive guy who was recycling garbage. I don't know. But in any case, he had, only the faintest memory of any of the Crumbs. Didn't remember Charles Crumb. And he's another person I would have loved to have the money to film as well, and flown back east and taken the chance to film him. He seemed agreeable to it. He just didn't seem to remember much about it. So I don't know if he would have had much to say, but it would have been interesting to see him today in any case. But he had no money.
Now I have even less money, but I'm not making a feature film because I'm just some jackass on the internet. So I was thinking, what if I reach out to Scutch? Maybe he'll do an interview with me. Well, Crumb Bums? Turns out he's fucking dead. The nickname Scutch, which he spelt with a C apparently, stuck to the end as Dwayne Arthur Kenton Sr. died at the beginning of 2021. That's about a year before I started this series. He was 78 and still lived in Milford, Delaware with his wife of nearly 6 decades. He had 6 kids and more grandkids than I care to count. His oldest son died the following year in 2022, and they actually called him Scutchy. Scutch was an elk who owned several businesses and loved drag racing and country music, and everyone liked him, I guess. Of course, one person who definitely had no love for Scutch was Charles Crumb in 1992, when he ended his life with a fatal dose of his psychiatric meds. In Charles's letters in the lead-up to his suicide, he talks very plainly about the brutality he experienced at Milford High School, and he clearly carried that trauma and isolation with him to the bitter end. In a 2014 interview on his website, Robert said, "They would beat him up publicly in front of everybody. There'd be big crowds standing around. He became an outcast. He claimed later, when he started being open about his sexuality, that he was not strongly heterosexual. In his early teens, he was kind of on the borderline, and then that whole Scutch thing in high school just kind of pushed him into a weird kind of homosexual fantasy about young boys. It pushed him back towards a prepubescent sexuality." We talked a bit about Charles's crippling obsession with Treasure Island child star Bobby Driscoll in episode number 13, Nuts Boy, so check that out if you want to learn more. And I'm certainly not saying that Scutch dealt a killing blow that just took 30 years to finish off Charles. Obviously, there were a myriad of other factors. Repressed sexuality, an overbearing mother, just general mental illness, he was probably a schizophrenic, and of course there were other bullies, including his own father, Charles Crumb Sr., who we talked about in episode number 7, White Man, a story of civilization in crisis. But it all adds up. And how does Robert feel about Dwayne Kenton today? Well, in the final mention of Scutch, in My Troubles with Women Part 2, Crumb depicts himself as a bitter old man, ranting and raving, "I still hate Scutch. If I saw him today, I'd tell him a thing or two, but then he'd probably punch me out." However, in that 2014 interview on his website, more than 20 years after my troubles with women and the suicide of Charles, he was asked, "Are you still angry at Scutch?" Crumb replied, "I still have a generalized anger about that aspect of human nature. This is the way nature is. Teenagers. There's always going to be some bully boys, some alpha male bullies who pick on the weaker ones to show how tough they are. It's just the way the world is." And I realize about that high school in Milford, talking to some of these people much later, some of them actually got over that and turned out to be very decent people. It's just part of adolescence. Even that Scutch guy ended up opening a recycling center somewhere around there. But Scutch in high school, he was awful. And it was doubly stinging and painful because there were so many girls that liked him. I think this response shows growth and an overall decline in bitterness, at least directed towards Scutch as an individual, as a person. Making these comics, coupled with just time and age, has probably helped him let go of a lot of baggage. And I mean, he's right. Bullying does seem to naturally emerge within social structures. Like, Scutch zeroed in on Charles's weakness and humiliated and tortured him in high school. But Charles, by all accounts, would do that to Robert at home, and Robert would in turn bully the youngest Crumb brother, Maxon. I was certainly bullied and ostracized by the cool and normal kids in high school, and it was only years later that I learned that the ragtag group of losers that formed my social circle considered me a bully to them. I thought we were friends, but it turns out that all of the jokes and cartoons I'd make, frankly as a way to cope with my own teenage alienation, were actually cruel and hurtful to them. Who knew? Well, they did and I didn't. That was a problem. And I feel bad about that. And with the internet and the social medias, we all exist now in a digital environment that enables relentless 24/7 bullying. And not just kids and teens either. According to a 2020 Pew Research Center survey, a full quarter of American adults report having experienced extreme forms of online harassment, such as sustained harassment, physical threats, stalking, and sexual harassment, a 10% increase from 6 years earlier in 2014. And some of those people being harassed are probably also turning around and harassing other people online. You know, it's own or get owned out there. Sometimes to a permanent end. Take, for example, the recent case of fellow cartoonist and YouTuber Ed Piskor. Along with Jim Rugg, he co-hosted the popular alt-comic show, Cartoonist Kayfabe. They covered a lot of the same alternative and underground comics that we enjoy on this channel, including quite a bit of Crumb, so check out their archives. Ed was the target of a vicious cancellation and internet pylon by self-righteous virtue bullies over 3 contentious accusations of impropriety towards women, one of which was admittedly still 17 when they met. Following the initial complaint, virtually every corner of comics fandom was awash with relentless condemnation, speculation, and mockery.
The next day,
Ed and Jim deleted their Twitter accounts and shuttered their popular YouTube channel. And a slew of unvetted clickbait articles were released with headlines like, "Multiple women accuse cartoonist Ed Piskor of grooming and misconduct," many pairing the sexual accusations with spurious insinuations of racism, anti-Semitism, and even falsely identifying Ed as the secret owner of a Comicsgate-adjacent Twitter profile associated with far-right politics, misogyny, and queer bashing. The implication being, of course he's guilty of sexual misconduct and grooming. He's a Trump supporter. Which wasn't true, and wouldn't have been a fair line to draw, even if it was true. His hometown art exhibition was cancelled, and the news showed up to his and his elderly parents' houses, which they aired without even blurring the addresses. Ed's silence was taken as a tacit admission of guilt, and the mob's suspicions were quickly being cast on his co-host Jim and anyone who defended Ed or even called for de-escalation pending more information.
3 days later.
That was all within the first 48 to 72 hours. By the week's end, the discourse was at a fever pitch. The cartoonist Kayfabe channel was in limbo. Ed's publisher Fantagraphics distanced themselves. Abrams retracted a $75,000 publishing deal. And his co-host Jim Rugg, to safeguard his own career, was forced to publicly disavow his best friend.
1 week later.
That was 7 days, from Saturday evening to Saturday morning. The following Monday, Ed Piskor posted a suicide note to his Facebook, denying the serious allegations and encouraging his family to seek legal action against one of the accusers. By lunchtime, Ed Piskor was confirmed dead. Here's some of his chilling final words. I was murdered by internet bullies. Massive amounts of them. Some of you out there absolutely contributed to my death as you were entertaining yourself with gossip. I wasn't AI. I was a real human being. You chipped little bits of my self-esteem away all week until I was vaporized. A lot of people will say that it's consequences, not cancellation. But even if Ed hadn't killed himself, the consequences of the scandal were not merited by the weight of the accusations. Certainly not based on the evidence that was presented. And while obviously Ed felt that he was bullied to death, I don't think it's fair to blame the mob and his accusers, any more than it's fair to blame Scutch for Charles's suicide. There were likely underlying mental health issues, but a sudden loss of career and livelihood and mass public humiliation were clearly major factors. But that's not the end of it, because Ed named about a half dozen people that he believed led the charge against him. And while seemingly none of these people have displayed even an iota of sympathy for Ed's tragic end, or any self-reflection about the role they might have played in helping to isolate and drive someone to that level of desperation, it's still a bad thing that now the self-righteous virtue bullies have themselves become the targets of a different group of self-righteous anti-virtue bullies, many of whom also spent Ed's final week bullying him with videos and memes in an attempt to milk whatever libidinal joy they could extract from the left eating one of its own, and who now hypocritically hold Ed up as some sort of martyr to cancel culture. And just stop it. Here's the takeaway. Don't be bullying people. Just be nice to one another, okay? Or at the very least, be nice to cartoonists. That's all for today, Crumbums. If you like this program, please remember to hit like, hit subscribe, be a ding-dong daddy, and ding that bell. I think it's over there now. I've been your host, Kyle Bridget. You can find my links in the show description. And hey, check out Potter ZB, the comic book nerdcast that dares to ask, what, me worry? Where along with my co-idiot Patrick, we explore comics and culture, including Crumb, all through the lens of the Mad Magazine ethos. If you want to support this program and myself, you'll also find my Patreon and donation links in the show description as well. And hey, why not pick up the unlicensed Canonically Crumb t-shirt, available now in a variety of sizes and colors on my Redbubble store. Canonically Crumb will be back as weekly as possible with another deep dive into the Crummyverse. Thanks again, Crumbums, and keep on grooving.